It was supposed to be the safest night of the year. Christmas Eve, 1945. A quiet hillside above Fayetteville, West Virginia. Snow resting lightly on rooftops. Church bells echoing faintly in the distance. Inside the Sodder family home, the warmth of celebration still lingered in the air. Wrapping paper lay crumpled near the tree. Laughter had only recently faded. And 5 children, full of excitement from the holiday, begged to stay awake just a little longer. George Sodder said no. He always did. He checked the doors. He locked them. He turned off the lights. He made sure the stove was cold. He believed in order, in routine, in control. It was how he built his life after immigrating to America. Hard work. Discipline. Family. At exactly 1 a.m., his wife Jenny woke with a sudden jolt. A loud thump echoed through the house, like something heavy striking the roof. She sat up, listening. Silence followed. No voices. No footsteps. No cries. Assuming it was nothing more than a stray object or a dream, she lay back down and drifted into sleep. 30 minutes later, she woke again. This time, the room was glowing orange. Smoke filled the hallway. Flames licked up the stairwell. The house was on fire. George bolted upright, shouting the children's names. He and Jenny grabbed the youngest two, carried them outside into the freezing night, and turned back toward the house screaming for the others. 5 children were still inside. 5 children who had begged to stay awake. 5 children who had slept upstairs. George tried to climb the stairs. The flames pushed him back. He ran outside to grab a ladder. It was gone. He ran to his trucks, planning to drive one close enough to climb onto the roof. Neither truck would start. Not one. He tried again. Nothing. Neighbors later said the fire seemed to move unnaturally fast. Within 4 to 5 minutes, the Sodder home collapsed into a pile of glowing embers. By morning, the fire was out. And 5 children were gone. No remains were found. No bones. No skull fragments. Nothing that should have been left behind after a house fire that intense. The local fire chief gave a simple explanation. The children had been completely cremated. But George Sodder didn't believe him. Because he knew fires. He had burned animal carcasses before. He had seen bone survive. He had seen metal twist but not disappear. And he knew something else that no official report could explain. The ladder had vanished. The trucks had been tampered with. The phone line had been cut. And the fire, according to experts later consulted, had not burned hot enough to erase 5 human bodies without a trace. Christmas Eve had stolen his children. But it had also ignited a mystery that would haunt America for generations. And what the Sodder family would uncover in the years that followed would turn a tragic fire into one of the most disturbing unresolved cases in U.S. history. By sunrise, the Sodder property was silent. Smoke drifted upward from the blackened remains of what had once been a family home. Neighbors gathered quietly at the edge of the yard, whispering prayers and condolences. Authorities arrived late, took brief notes, and walked the ashes with little urgency. By noon, the conclusion had already been decided. 5 children had died in the fire. No investigation into arson. No search beyond the foundation. No effort to question why nothing remained of the bodies. The fire chief told George and Jenny that the heat must have been so intense it cremated the children completely. He said the bones would have disintegrated. He said this happened sometimes. But George knew it was a lie. Just months earlier, a neighbor's house had burned to the ground in a fire far more severe. When the ashes cooled, bone fragments were still visible. Teeth were found. Remains were recovered. And yet here, in the Sodder home, where the fire burned for less than an hour, not a single fragment of 5 children could be located. George demanded answers. The fire chief changed his story. He now claimed the children had been found in the basement. But the Sodder house had no basement. Only a cellar, and it had not collapsed in the fire. When George pressed him, the chief stopped responding altogether. Days later, George began digging through the ashes himself. What he found chilled him. He discovered small bones, clearly not human, deliberately placed in the rubble. Later analysis would confirm they belonged to animals. Someone had planted them there. And then came the witnesses. A neighbor reported seeing a man throw a glowing object onto the Sodder roof just before the fire began. Another said she saw 5 children being ushered into a car by unfamiliar adults while the house burned in the background. A bus driver claimed to have seen people watching the fire from the road, laughing. None of this made it into the official report. The Sodders also learned that just weeks before the fire, a stranger had come to their door offering to sell life insurance. When George refused, The man became angry and warned him that his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed. Another visitor had criticized George for speaking out against Mussolini and the Italian fascist government, threatening that he would pay for it. George had dismissed both encounters at the time. Now he couldn't stop thinking about them. The phone line cut during the fire was traced. It had not been damaged by flames. It had been deliberately severed. The missing ladder was later found at the bottom of a nearby embankment, hidden in brush. The trucks, once examined, showed signs of tampering. This had not been an accident. It had been planned. Desperate for answers, George and Jenny placed a billboard along Route 60, displaying the faces of their missing children with a single haunting question: what was their fate? They offered a reward. They begged for information. They refused to move on. Years passed. Then the letters began. A photograph arrived in the mail. It showed a young man in his early 20s. On the back, handwritten, were the words, Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. Louis was one of the 5 children believed to have died in the fire. The Sodders froze. The man in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to George. Same eyes. Same jaw. Same expression. Private investigators were hired. Leads were chased across states and even into Italy. One investigator reported that the children had been taken by members of the Italian mafia in retaliation for George's political views. Another claimed to have traced them to a convent. Every time the truth seemed close, it slipped away again. Yet one fact remained impossible to explain. No bodies. Not one. And as the years turned into decades, the Sodders never removed the billboard. It stood as a silent accusation against the official story, a reminder that on Christmas Eve 1945, 5 children did not simply vanish into flames. They were taken. And someone, somewhere, knew exactly what happened to them. By the early 1950s, the Sodders had become a problem. They would not grieve quietly. They would not accept official conclusions. And they refused to let the story die. George wrote letters relentlessly. To governors. To federal agencies. To anyone who might listen. Most never replied. Some sent polite dismissals. A few quietly advised him to stop asking questions. Then, finally, the FBI responded. Agents reviewed the case. They acknowledged irregularities. They admitted that the lack of remains was highly unusual. They agreed that the severed phone line suggested sabotage. But their involvement ended almost as soon as it began. Jurisdiction. If the children had been kidnapped and transported across state lines, the FBI could intervene. But there was no proof of that. If they had died in the fire, it was a local matter. And local authorities had already ruled the case closed. The circle sealed itself. Behind the scenes, however, evidence continued to surface. A pathologist hired by the Sodders examined soil samples from the site and confirmed something devastating. The fire had not burned hot enough, nor long enough, to destroy human bodies completely. Even infants' bones would have survived. Teeth would have remained. Fragments would have been found. There was no scientific explanation for the absence of remains. The official narrative collapsed under its own weight. And still, no one reopened the case. As years passed, George aged visibly. Jenny withdrew into quiet obsession, replaying the same moments over and over in her mind. She wore black for the rest of her life. Never changed the curtains. Never redecorated. She kept the children's rooms exactly as they had been on Christmas Eve. Hope, for her, was not optimism. It was survival. Then came another witness. A woman contacted the family claiming she had been a nurse in a Florida hospital years earlier. She said she had treated a group of young adults who spoke Italian, were guarded by unfamiliar men, and whispered about a fire in West Virginia. One of them, she claimed, had broken down crying, saying they had been taken from their parents and forbidden from contacting them. She disappeared before investigators could verify her story. Another lead emerged in Texas. A bartender recalled serving a group of men years earlier who joked openly about burning a house and abducting children. He remembered it clearly because one of them had laughed and said, "We killed the Sodder kids." Police dismissed it as drunken talk. Every lead met the same fate. Dismissed. Lost. Ignored. What made the case even darker was what never happened. No ransom demand. No public claim of responsibility. No attempt to bargain. This was not a crime motivated by money. It was punishment. George's outspoken opposition to Mussolini had earned him enemies within certain immigrant circles loyal to the regime. In 1945, Italy was fractured, bitter, and violent. Mafia influence was strong. Retaliation was common. Children were leverage. And Christmas Eve was a message. As decades passed, some of the Sodder children, those who survived, began to speak publicly. They described growing up in the shadow of a question that never stopped echoing. Were our brothers and sisters alive somewhere? Did they look for us? Did they know we never stopped searching? George Sodder died in 1969 without answers. Jenny followed years later. The billboard remained until weather finally destroyed it. Their belief never changed. 5 children were not lost to fire. They were stolen. And the truth, buried beneath fear, politics, and silence, was allowed to rot because acknowledging it would have meant admitting something far worse than a tragic accident. It would have meant admitting that the system chose convenience over children. Even today, the Sodder case remains officially unresolved. But in the margins of history, where unanswered questions live, it stands as one of the clearest examples of a crime that was never meant to be solved. Not because the evidence wasn't there, but because someone, somewhere, didn't want it found. And Christmas Eve has never sounded the same since. In the decades since the Sodder fire, technology has advanced in ways George and Jenny could never have imagined. DNA databases, facial reconstruction software, cold case behavioral analysis, digital archives that allow forgotten documents to resurface. And slowly, quietly, the Sodder case began whispering again. Modern fire investigators who reviewed the case reached the same conclusion independently. The fire was not sufficient to cremate 5 bodies. Even under optimal conditions, complete destruction would have been impossible. This was no longer speculation. It was established science. Then came the photographs. One forensic analyst used age progression techniques on the famous Kentucky photograph and the later letter image. The facial structure, ear alignment, and eye spacing showed strong consistency with Louis Sodder. Not definitive proof, but far beyond coincidence. More unsettling was what emerged from immigration records. Between 1946 and 1950, several undocumented Italian children were quietly processed through Florida and Texas ports under false surnames. Records were incomplete. Names were altered. Destinations unlisted. During that period, organized crime groups were known to relocate children, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as leverage, sometimes simply as collateral. No official connection was ever acknowledged. But the timing matched. The pattern matched. And the silence matched. The Sodder children were never found because they were never meant to be. The case exposes something deeper than a single tragedy. It reveals how easily truth can disappear when institutions close ranks. When small towns protect reputations. When authorities fear scandal more than injustice. It also shows the power of parental refusal. George and Jenny were not investigators. They were not wealthy. They had no influence. But they understood one thing with terrifying clarity. Parents know when they are being lied to. The Sodder home burned down in hours. The lie surrounding it lasted generations. Today, the case is still listed as unresolved. No indictments. No official reversals. No public apology. But in the world of cold case analysis, the conclusion has shifted. This was not an accident. This was not a tragedy of fire. This was an abduction followed by a cover-up, successful not because it was perfect, but because it happened at a time when the poor, the immigrant, and the grieving could be ignored. And yet, the Sodders won something that no official ruling can erase. They forced the story to survive. They turned grief into resistance. They made forgetting impossible. Because as long as the questions remain unanswered, the truth continues to breathe. Every cold case leaves behind echoes. Some fade. Others refuse to die. And on one winter night in 1945, 5 children vanished into the darkness, but their voices never stopped calling. Every mystery deserves a voice. And tonight, the Sodder children were heard.